Hi guys, welcome to the channel. As you can see, we're here in Tolkien-esque Shropshire. This is the area where Tolkien lived when he wrote and conceived The Lord of the Rings, apparently, and it is pretty spectacular in normal weather. Of course, we've chosen the one day to come out when the weather is absolutely dire. It's windy, it's about to rain, and the whole this whole shoot has been blighted by misfortune. So let's talk about the video. The video today is about Affinity Photo, and it covers the entire workflow from importing a raw file through the develop persona into the photo persona, and I'm going to talk about the differences between those two personas. Now, that might seem as though it's quite similar to the subject matter of the Affinity 2.6 review that I did about a month ago, but the reason that I'm doing this is because I've discovered that there are actually depths to Affinity Photo that I didn't really cover too much in that original review video, which is okay because it was just a review of new features, but actually the way that you approach Affinity Photo is different. And the metaphor of the develop persona being basically Lightroom and the photo persona being Photoshop really holds water a little bit, but it's not the whole story by any stretch of the imagination. So we're going to look at both of those personas. We're going to look at what I consider to be the best use of those personas, the most constructive use for photographers to get it right and not waste time in their workflow. So without further ado, let's get into it. The expectation from a lot of photographers now is that you can actually do a photograph beginning to end in Lightroom, and you can. I do many myself. And I think this is different in Affinity Photo. Now, the reason that I think this is different is because in Lightroom what happens, and it's the same with DxO Photolab, is that when you import your picture, the demosaicing process happens, pre-sharpening happens, and the picture you're presented with in some cases looks pretty good. In other cases it doesn't. It looks very flat, and that, you know, broadly reflects the circumstances in which the photo was taken. However, as far as I can make out in Affinity Photo, the demosaicing process simply consists of making your original raw file viewable on the screen. So as far as I can tell, there's no pre-sharpening done. This photograph here looks very flat. There is very little that I would call, you know, sharp. When I compare this to importing the same photograph in Lightroom, the same photograph in DxO Photolab, I get a radically different result. And so I've moved to a perspective where I think that the best way to work with the develop persona is actually in preparing the picture for further development in the photo persona. And so that is a slightly different viewpoint, and I'm going to try to illustrate that viewpoint in this video. So let's get stuck in and see what we want to do with this picture. The first thing to talk about here is you've got some choices in your output from the develop persona. Now, this is really important because if I make changes to the picture and output them to a pixel layer, those changes are baked into the pixel layer, and that is the only way to come back and change that, is to come back and start the whole process again. Your choices here are pixel layer, raw layer embedded, and raw layer linked. Now what this means is that raw layer embedded will embed a copy of your original raw file into the pixel layer, which means that you can go back and change some of the alterations that you might have made in this develop phase. Raw layer linked dynamically links the picture that you're creating in the pixel layer to your original raw file, and that link will remain intact and allow you to edit, make changes, and so on that you may have made in the develop persona. Now the gotcha here, of course, is that should you change your file structure, that link will be broken, and so that's lost. Now my own preference, and it is my own preference, is to work with the pixel layer. So what I've come to the conclusion is that I will use the develop persona to make corrections to the image. The first correction I'm probably going to make, and this one is definitely debatable, but there are a lot of arguments for doing a crop before rather than after your output. So let's go ahead and make that crop. So I will take this into 16. I will go for 16 by 9 in this. I'll make this a custom ratio. I'll change this to 16 by 9. And I always like this ratio because it's sort of more cinematic. It fits the and let's just position this. Whoops. And let's just shift this around so we don't have any distractions in the front. And the sky is potentially going to introduce drama into this shot, which I think is probably a good thing. Okay, so the choices are to have this down here and get rid of the sky entirely, but I think on balance the drama in the sky outweighs the look of the foreground in this picture, and mixing it up introduces some light areas in the foreground that were probably more distraction than anything else. So I'm going to take it up to here and we'll just drop that there. Okay. Now I can crop this smaller in the photo persona, but I'm probably not going to want to do that. So this will now stick with this for the duration. Okay, now other things that I've done here is take you to have a quick look at my settings, because these two are important. I've set my color profile to Adobe RGB. I think this is important when you're editing because it gives you the greatest range of colors. So this is a pretty important thing. Now secondly, in the raw assistant settings, I've made a couple of changes. So I'm using the Seriflabs raw engine, and I'm going to set my output format to RGB 16-bit. If I wanted to do this in HDR, or the modern definition of HDR, I could choose this to set this to 32-bit, but I'm going with 16-bit. And this one is important. I've applied a default tone curve. This basically gives me more contrast in the starting position. So it's really a time-saving thing. Whether you choose to do this or not is entirely up to you. Adjust my exposure and this one is pretty well exposed, and you're really more or less in the middle here. We've got some very dark doorways, so I'm not sure that that's massively important in this picture. And we've certainly got a lot of leeway here in where the black point is set. So if I increase my black point here, I'm not going to treat this as an edit, but I'm going to bring this a little bit further down. You can see that it's bringing in a lot more contrast into the picture without making it too light. And this is often a little bit of a juggling act. We want to keep the drama in the sky. We want to bring this black point in a little bit. Now what we don't want is to get really stark areas here. So we're going to leave that where it is, I think, for the moment. Now I'm going to go to the Lens tab and just make sure that I've got a lens profile applied. And this was the Canon, it wasn't the 2.8, it was the 4. So I go with that choice, and I tick that lens profile on, and you can see immediately it's applied a difference there. And the other thing I want to do is to get rid of any chromatic aberration that there might be in the picture. It will take a second or two to come through. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so you can see already this picture is looking sharper and brighter. The last thing I want to do is actually go into my Details tab. I've got noise reduction switched on, but its luminance, if there is any, I'll just set this to a very low number, and this is effectively pre-sharpening. Colors is at 20%. If I look at this up close, I don't think we've got a noise problem here. We might have a sharpness problem, but we don't have a noise problem. So if we go to our detail refinement and we push this up a little bit, we should start seeing some more detail in here. Set the radius to around 10, and we'll push the amount up, and if we're looking at this quite closely, we can see we've got a lot sharper. Take that away and it's not all that sharp at all. So that's my pre-sharpening done. Now if I go into my split view here, that's before, this is after. At this point, I think that's pretty much all the repairing that I want to do. And, so what I will do is I'll commit this. So this goes to develop. We can start to have a look at what happens or what we can add to this using layers. And I'm going to try to point out why this is more flexible than using overlays. and the reason for that is obviously that I can alter these after the fact and come back to it. I can also, once I've got a few layers added and a few alterations added, I can change the intensity of individual layers, which will have quite a radical effect on the entire picture. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is add a few layers and make some adjustments to the way that this picture is looking. Now, the first thing is the contrast has really become quite high here. I don't think these blacks really matter that much, but it looks like a very cloudy day, so the light would therefore be quite soft and not have these extreme blacks that are turning up here. So this is, I find, slightly disconcerting. It's getting slightly away from the level. So what we do here, we'll add a levels layer. Okay, now traditionally what you do with the levels layer is you bring your black level in. This of course increases the contrast. My white level could come in a little bit as well, and what I'm going to do to alleviate this a little is to just take back my gamma layer, so I'm introducing a bit more light in the midtones, and this sort of takes the worst excesses of the black shadows away. So I think that will do. Now notice that I can change the opacity here. I can also change the blend mode, but that I think is a session for another day. And I think this is fine for the moment. So there's my levels layer. The next thing I'm going to do is alter some of the colours in this. I want more, a little bit more sort of emphasis on the yellows here in the foreground. I liven up my greens ever so slightly, not massively, because as I say, with all these clouds, this is quite a soft light. So I don't want this to become really high contrast, but I do want it to become a little bit more lively than perhaps it is at the moment. So here we're going to add another adjustment layer, and this will be a selective color layer, and I can go through all of my colors here, making such adjustments as I feel are necessary. Okay, so if I go to my greens, I've got cyan, magenta, yellow to play with here, and it's always a good idea to take this back and forth and see what difference it's making, if any. And I think in the greens, but the yellows, we can really bring those yellows up. So interestingly, the green, it looks as though the greens are responding better to the yellows than they are to the greens. So we'll just take that to around about there. We don't want to do anything too rash here. You can take any sort of blue tinge out of those yellows, and that helps a bit. Keep the cyan in. We don't want it to look too baked. I think that's so the effect of removing the magenta here is to make this very green indeed, which we don't want to do, but we don't want to make it look completely deserty. We want some life in those shrubs. I think that's fine. The other colour that I'm interested in are the blues up here. Now this is really natural. If you look at horizons, they always have a blue tinge, and we want to keep this blue tinge. Now the simple debate is whether we want more or less magenta in it. If I take the magenta out, it turns it slightly, makes it slightly warmer looking, slightly greyer looking. If I add magenta, it becomes a bit purply. So I think I'm going to take some of that magenta out now and take some of the cyan out. We don't want this to become too much blue, and we definitely don't want the yellow in it, so we'll leave that alone. We've also got black available, but that's not really having a massive amount of difference, so I'll click that in there. Okay. The last thing that I want to do here, we've got quite a bit of contrast. I'm just going to add a little bit more here, and that will be a curves layer. So it's just an adjustment layer, and I'm looking for curves. I've got it here, and bearing in mind that we don't want these blacks to become any blacker, I'm going to fix a point here. So that any adjustment I do here is going to leave those blacks alone. And what I want to do is just a little touch on this. So we can see my shadows in the middle are not really getting touched too much. I think I'm going to pull that down ever so slightly. Push that up ever so slightly. Okay, and I think that's pretty decent actually. That's pretty much where I wanted to be with this picture. I can address opacity in this layer. Take that layer away, put it back. I can change the opacity of this layer, which effectively removes my color adjustment. But I can adjust it to taste as well, so I might feel that that's a little bit strong and just want to take it down there, maybe. You know, these are really a matter of subjective taste. But the opacity slider on each layer will adjust the extent to which that is applied. So if I take my levels adjustment away, you can see that I've lightened the picture up quite considerably. So I'm going to leave my levels adjustment at 100% here. Other thing I can do is do a simple before and after by switching these layers off. So, oops. So not the original layer. So this was my picture out of develop. I added levels, which brightened the picture up a little bit. I did selective color adjustment, which brought the colors more to life, I think. And I did a small curves adjustment, which just had a very, very light effect on the sky. And I think that's where I would leave this picture. Okay, so back in the studio, except it's not really the studio, it's still the wild and open landscape of Shropshire in the United Kingdom. I hope this video has proved useful. If it has, please drop down below, give us a like, give us a subscribe. We're going to have a lot more videos, not just on Affinity Photo, but also on camera work and photography, and as the weather gets better, which it might might well do this week. We're going to feature a few more walkabouts and on location shoots. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, nip down, give us a subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot, guys.